Hi,
What's up, Nate?
it's Pastor Nate.
George.
We are going to talk about Jesus, surprise, and what we're going to do specifically is talk about Jesus and the different churches that he worked with.
Okay.
We don't always think about it like this, but the truth is that Jesus had a position at 5 different churches.
Hey, you told me a little bit about this, and that sounds pretty scary.
Scary?
Yeah, it does.
Why is it
It's a
scary?
lot of jobs.
It's a lot of jobs. Well, once you see what he actually did, most of them, it's one job at multiple churches. So you'll see.
Oh, okay.
But what I wanted to do is show you actually on a map, and we're going to try to share my screen here. And in theory, that should be working. So this is Jerusalem, as you can see. This is actually just Google Maps. It's not a special, cool, old map. It's just right here and now. I always, whenever I think about the Holy Land and geography, I always think about this exact thing. You got up here, this little blue circle thingy is the Sea of Galilee.
Oh, okay.
And then down here is the Dead Sea. And between those two is the River Jordan.
Is it dry right now?
No, it's not dry. It's just we're zoomed out. So
oh, okay. I see the water now. Yeah,
you see it? Yeah.
Okay.
It's, I mean, really, it's this line. In some places, it's very thin.
Okay.
But in other places, it's not. If you go up here to like the Sea of Galilee, you can see like the mouth of it actually coming out.
Yes.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah.
Jordan River, yeah.
Wow.
So a lot of times when I'm studying for sermons and stuff like that, or just doing Bible study, I will actually go to the place where it happened, take the little guy, and drop him off and see what it looks like today.
Oh, okay.
But so that's the first like main geographical like guide. And then Jerusalem is relatively around the Dead Sea area, like it looks that way on the map. And then Nazareth is by the Sea of Galilee. And so that kind of gives us 4 points of reference to kind of find where we're at. So that's just my little tricks for geography, biblical geography. Jesus grew up in Nazareth. So we'll zoom in there. And in Nazareth, he would have grown up there, and he had some kind of a position at the synagogue in Nazareth. And the way that I know that is because is a couple of things. One is that he later on is called rabbi. And in order to be respected as a teacher and a rabbi, you have to gain that credibility from another rabbi. You have to be trained.
Okay.
And so he grew here, and we know that there was a synagogue here. There was a guy that taught. We don't know anything about that individual, but he must have existed. And Jesus grew up there, and we know that Jesus eventually goes there and preaches, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But so Jesus grew up in Nazareth, doing some stuff at the church. He would have started off as like a young man being discipled, being trained. And then like what position did he have at Nazareth? It's unlikely that he was like the preaching rabbi there in his youth, because one, I think if he had been doing that, his ministry would have like overshadowed other people's because he's really, really good at it. But the other side of it is when he finally preaches in Nazareth later on in his life, it reads in the scriptures, in Luke and stuff, as if it's like an unusual event. Like it's not like, and then he preached again that Sabbath. It was like, then he was called to come here and speak. It was like a very important moment. And the reaction is that they attempted to kill him because he preached, about himself being the Messiah. So because of that, and because of the types of positions that were available besides the church, it's actually most likely that Jesus was basically like the worship leader.
Oh.
At the church in Nazareth, some kind of like the music director type role, and that tracks with what we know from church history, because early church history actually talks about James, Jesus' little brother, and it tells us clearly that he was able to. He was like the worship leader in Jerusalem at that church, and that people like to come and hear him because it reminded them of Jesus. And so the implication there is that Jesus sang or was in some way musical. So this is, it makes sense. And actually also as a carpenter, as a woodworker, he would have probably made wooden instruments and known how to tune them so that he could sell them. So you put all that together, and it's likely that Jesus played some kind of wooden stringed instrument and sang. It was actually involved in some kind of worship ministry in Nazareth.
So is that what he would have done in all the other churches?
No, I don't think so, because you don't see any reference to and that's that. Now we're just talking about opinions. I do think he always had something musical going on, but that wasn't his primary role. So what happens is when he's in his 30s, I'll zoom out here. He comes over to the Jordan River. Do you know why? The very beginning of his ministry?
Baptism?
To be baptized by John, his cousin, right? Mm-hmm. And John and Jesus have this ministry for a little while where it's really more so John's, but they just walk up and down the Jordan River and preach. And really John is the one that preaches. They go back and forth between these two bodies of water and preach up and down the Jordan River. If you look in John chapter 1, the Gospel of John, you see Jesus really just making disciples, just like leading small groups and taking on small groups of young people that he builds his discipleship group on, not necessarily preaching. That's more like John's thing. So that's kind of how things start. And it also, like, it's important to note that Jesus, we always think of John having this like long period of ministry before Jesus comes along.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence to suggest that John did ministry without Jesus. We just assume that because Jesus walked in on him baptizing people.
Yeah, that is what I always assumed.
But like, if you think about it, there's no evidence, there's no writings, even that story, like maybe he was out there for days, weeks without Jesus, and maybe not. Maybe Jesus was just a part of it from the beginning, and just now it's time for him to be baptized. But we kind of make assumptions, but there's really nothing written about that. It's actually more likely that these two cousins started a church planting ministry together, where they shared the gospel and did these things. Now, John is, this wild prophet guy, but Jesus has credibility because of his time in Nazareth. Whoever his rabbi was in Nazareth would have given his credibility to Jesus as a young rabbi. So the whole movement is still within the basic synagogue system or church movement of that day. But that doesn't last. So as they're doing this ministry, though, there's this little place, and it's no longer on the map because, it's been 2,000 years. But somewhere, you see Jericho? Mm-hmm. That's where the walls were that they knocked down. That's the biblical city of Jericho. And Jesus got baptized somewhere in this general area. There's actually, if I could search for it, but I'm going to do it right now because of time, but you can actually find like the traditional spot where they have a little baptism area off the Jordan where they say that's where Jesus was actually baptized. It's somewhere in this area. But also somewhere over here, like in this general area, was a town called Perea. Okay. And Perea would have been on their little circuit going back and forth up here. And later on, we know Perea became a church. And so really, people are getting saved and starting that ministry at the very beginning. This is probably the first church plant by Jesus and John, is the church at Perea. Way later, when the Romans come in here and attack Judea, the Jerusalem church at the time was led by James. He takes them and they go to Perea. And that becomes like the center of the church for a little while because it's not being attacked. And it's actually probably further down here by Jericho in this area. But so that's Perea, somewhere in that general area. It's hard to see nowadays, but that would have been a place where Jesus and John started a church. And then in John 3, Jesus talks to in John 3?
No.
Nicodemus.
Okay.
John 3:16, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it's actually Passover of his first year, and he comes into Jerusalem, and he meets with Nicodemus. And Nicodemus had a synagogue or a church in Jerusalem. And so he has this gospel conversation with Nicodemus, and Nicodemus's ministry now kind of joins in with Jesus's ministry. And whenever he goes back to Jerusalem, it's likely that he has a relationship with Nicodemus, and they kind of meet there. And that church, it was actually his house and his synagogue. This is in Jewish history. It becomes the upper room where it's like the book of like the day of Pentecost and Acts happens, which becomes like the central location for the Christian church of Jerusalem. So that's all in the same place. And so that church, which is kind of like considered to be the first Christian church by most conversations, is actually technically the third church that Jesus worked at. And then it's after that that the controversial thing happens. So you've got, where'd it go? Here's Nazareth, right? And there's Jerusalem. Oh, and just one more fact about that. Nicodemus down here, it's likely because of the things that Jesus teaches and the way he says things, that Jesus's rabbi, also because of geography, there's people that live in these places historically that suggest this. The rabbi that Jesus served under originally was probably mentored by Nicodemus. So there's like this network of rabbis, or like this delineation of like Nicodemus would have looked at Jesus as like a grandfather type relationship, which is one of the reasons it's significant when Jesus sort of flips it and starts talking like he's the Messiah. But so there's that connection of both these synagogues giving Jesus credibility. But what happens is he goes into this place, and it's not really reflected on a modern day map, but this area right here, you might even say it if we zoom out, but West Bank and this whole area, in biblical times was called Samaria. And so this is where you've heard this story before, that the woman at the well, stuff like that happens, and the whole thing about how Jews generally walk along the Jordan and go around Samaria, but Jesus went through it. We talk about this in church a lot.
So he would have, like in normal circumstances, they would have like made a beeline towards the
way it would work is from Nazareth or wherever you are in Galilee, you would go to the mouth right here of the Jordan and just follow it down, because there is a path through the hills right here, or the mountains really, that's faster, but they avoided it because of the Samaritans.
Okay.
And it takes longer, really, where they lose the day, because it's like an extra day and a half, is here, because it's hard to see on this map, but from like Jericho to Jerusalem, this trail is all uphill.
Ooh.
The whole thing is uphill. And so like you lose most of your time because you go through there, because the actual distance from like Nazareth to Jerusalem or like Jericho to Galilee, it's not that different. But the difference is that last bit of the trip is a full day of just straight uphill into Jerusalem. But anyways, so that was part of that. But Jesus and John both started doing ministry in Samaria, this middle area right here between Nazareth and Jerusalem, which was not okay. Racially speaking, the Jews and them were not allies. They were enemies, and they hated each other. And so for Jesus and John to do ministry there is a major problem. And what you see is people come to Christ, going at the well, other people, and that becomes a church. And you know that for sure because in Acts, they go back and visit that church, and it's got controversy because there's this dude named Simon there causing problems, and the apostles get involved. And so like that was for sure that there was a church that Jesus and John started up there. And so that's actually, you got Nazareth, Perea, Jerusalem, and Samaria. And again, if you Google it, you can find the church in Samaria that's at the well of Jacob. Like it's a place you can actually visit. A lot of these things have been sort of claimed that this is the spot. But there's one more church that is actually really famous that I haven't mentioned yet, because it happens in the story like this. They start doing ministry in Samaria, and then Jesus comes back down to Jerusalem for Pentecost of his first year, and he preaches down there at the temple, not the synagogue, but the temple. Big difference. And he preaches that he is the resurrection. And it's this big, big claim about his messiahship. And the next thing we know, he's up in Nazareth preaching. So what likely happened was that Jesus got in trouble for preaching this Messiah stuff.
Yeah.
And then his rabbi, who would have been the one that was responsible for him, kind of got pushed back and was like, he eventually reached out to Jesus and was like, you need to come home and preach this Sabbath. And you're preaching correct Jewish doctrine. I'm going to give you a chance to settle this by preaching the truth. And so likely when Jesus preached here, a bunch of different people, not just his own family and friends, although they would have been there too, the church probably swelled that day with people looking to see what Jesus would say.
Yeah.
If he was going to behave himself.
If there was going to be a fire or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And sure enough, he preached that he's the fulfillment of this passage in the Old Testament, and they got mad. They tried to kill him, which is always crazy to me that his his home church tried to kill him.
Yeah.
And right as that happens,
there's an amount of sadness to that.
Yeah, it's really.
I grew up around these people, and now they're trying
This
to.
is what's happening. Yeah, right as that happens, Scripture tells us that John, his cousin, is arrested. Like it's at the same basic time. And so that whole ministry of like, we're going to go up and down the Jordan, we get 5 churches or 4 churches involved, that whole thing kind of just falls apart because they deal with the 2 leaders of the ministry and it's considered heresy now. So what Jesus does, though, it doesn't really stop, though. What happens is Jesus goes to Capernaum, which is up here. Okay. And Capernaum is significant because that's where Peter and Andrew and James and John grew up, and their church home would have been there.
Okay.
And their dads, Jonah and Zebedee, were business owners, boat owners, and probably, it's not even probable, it's like for sure, they were like elders or deacons at the synagogue in Capernaum. Okay, so Jesus' uncle is Zebedee, because him and James and John are cousins with Jesus. And so Jesus has family in leadership of this church, and other people who are now his disciples have family that are in leadership of this church. So when they kick him out of Nazareth, he comes over to Capernaum. And that kind of becomes the place that now gives him credibility and gives him the ability to continue his ministry. And as far as we know, there's no reason not to assume that there's still the ministry of Nicodemus in Jerusalem that's loosely connected to the one up here. Perea is still doing its thing. Samaria is still active. It's just the Nazareth church that kind of falls off.
His home.
Yeah. But those are the 5 churches that Jesus does ministry with. The thing is, in the Gospel of John, it tells us after Jesus feeds the 5,000, which he does somewhere over in this area, people get mad and they go backwards. And he tells this story about feed the 5,000, talking to some people, and before all that, walking on water. And he tells that story, John tells us, he preaches those stories together as a sermon in the Capernaum synagogue. And it's after that, John tells us, that many disciples fall away. And also, if you read the narratives chronologically, and you do like a gospel harmony, like we were doing at church recently, Jesus never goes back to Capernaum and preaches after that. It's over. So likely what happened was that this church quit supporting Jesus for several reasons. But while he was there, he kind of quit traveling to the other churches and made a new circuit, which was just around the Sea of Galilee. So for most of his second year of ministry, he just goes in a circle around here, and on this sea, you can almost still kind of see them. There's all these little port towns, these little border, like little on the water little towns that would have all had a synagogue back then, or some kind of a gathering place to do the religious services. And Jesus would have visited all of them in that year and preached at them. And then once Capernaum drops him, he can't really get into any of them. They really stop kind of inviting him to come preach. So what happens then, it kind of goes towards the last year of his life, and he ends up back in Perea, in this area over here, and makes a brand new circuit, which is just traveling from Perea to Jerusalem, back and forth. And then he does that until the last week of his life, where he just spends the whole time in Jerusalem, Nicodemus' church, but a lot of it's at the temple. Yeah. And then his last supper, Nicodemus' synagogue, with the upper room. And then he dies. He gets crucified at Calvary, which is outside the gates over here. So it all kind of ends right here. But those are the 5 churches that Jesus was a part of. So he wasn't like a pastor at any of, like a senior pastor type role. Yeah. But he was like a worship leader at the first one. And then the rest of the other 4, he had like a church planter and networker type role. And that's really the whole reason I wanted to talk about this, because this is one of the ways. It's hard to find like a verse where Jesus is like, we should do church networking, because there's not a whole lot of Christian churches that he's really talking to. But this is one of the ways we can observe by Jesus working with these multiple churches and kind of having a role of leadership and influence between them, that he found it important for us to network as churches and to do ministry together. And what he really seemed to do was to make disciples in one place and then send them to another place. and have them do ministry at that other synagogue for a while
Mm-hmm.
as he traveled between them. And so it'd be almost like you and the youth group going to another church for like a month
Yeah,
and just blessing that church, and then coming back to here for a while and being like, yeah, we did this for a month and we did all this ministry there and we helped them, and now we're back and other churches doing that with us. It's kind of like what he was doing. And so it's interesting to see, but Jesus actually had this priority of churches working together from the very beginning of his ministry. We always think of him as like, it's Jesus and he's got his 12 best friends and they just kind of hang out for 3 years. But really, he was involved in a church planning strategy that started with disciple multiplication and grew out from there.
Yeah, yeah. That's really crazy to see that you pointed it out all on the map, like his routing and like how it shifted as like things came up.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
It's stuff to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, thanks for watching this. We'll see you soon.